Hello and good morning. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Lucian Freud's Paintings of Plants from Symbolism to Truth. I'm Vanessa Sellers, Director of the New York Botanical Gardens Humanities Institute, supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. With me is my colleague, Charles Zimmerman, Collections and Outreach Administrator for the Gardens William and Linda Steer Herbarium. We are so grateful to have you tune in from locations across the United States and around the world for what will be an inspiring hour looking at Lucian Freud's true passion for plants, showing surprisingly how this renowned artist wasn't only taken by the human figure, but also by the shape and the aesthetics of leaves and nature at large. Before we begin, a few housekeeping remarks. At any time during the presentations, we invite you to type questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will post them then for our speaker near the end of the program. Also, to enable live captions in English, please click the closed captions, the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and then click Show Subtitles or View Full Transcript. If you're experiencing any technical issues or have difficulty hearing, please use the chat feature or send Charles an email. His address is in the chat window. As a reminder, this presentation will be recorded. It will be archived and shared online in the NYBG Humanities Institute Lecture Library. And now, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome today's speaker, Giovanni Aloy, from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dr. Aloy is an author, an educator, and a curator, specializing in the representation of nature and the environment in art. He is an editor-in-chief of Antenne, the Journal of the Nature in Visual Culture, and has published extensively, focusing on topics at the intersection of art and natural history. His most recent works include Speculative Taxidermy, Natural History, Animal Services and Art in the Anthropocene in 2018, and Why Look at Plants, the Botanical Emergence in Contemporary Art in 2019, and just also last year, of course, published Lucian Freud's Herbarium. Dr. Aloy is co-editor of the Art After Nature series published by the University of Minnesota. And he's also a radio contributor there and a regular public speaker at the Art Institute of Chicago, and has curated exhibitions in the US and abroad. Dr. Aloy lectures on modern and contemporary art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and also at Sotheby's Institute of Art here in New York and in London. Well, here now is Dr. Aloy.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, Vanessa. It's a pleasure to be here, albeit virtually today, and to talk about Lucian Freud and my book on his paintings of plants. Before we begin focusing on Lucian Freud and his extensive body of work on plants that has been neglected up until now, I wanted to quickly make you aware of the recent publication of my journal, Antenne, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture that Vanessa mentioned, just to highlight that we are currently working and publishing a project dedicated entirely to plants. You can visit our website at www.antenne.org.uk and download for free the current and previous issue called Vegetal Entanglements, entirely dedicated about plants and contemporary art. And there will be another installment of Vegetal Entanglements published in March 2021. And just at a glance, my publications on animals and plants, a long-standing interest in my career. A book published recently in collaboration with Phaidon, dedicated to flowers, in the sciences and in art, which I think many of you might be interested in. And without any further ado, my Lucian Freud herbarium. We're going to look at what's so special about the representation of plants in Lucian Freud, in Lucian Freud's body of work. And since this talk has specifically been designed for the New York Botanical Garden, I will have the opportunity, which is very welcome, to focus more on the actual plants he painted and their history, how they came into his life, and what they meant to him. So, starting from the very beginning, I'm sure many of you are familiar that, Lucian Freud has a very famous grandfather. The surname gives it away, and this picture confirms it. Sigmund in London with Lucian. Lucian was actually born in Berlin in 1922. And his father was a Jewish architect, and his mother was called Lucy. Lucy was largely responsible for Lucian's love for art. It was her way to educate her son, to expose him to as much art as possible. While, of course, from Ernst, his father, Lucian inherited an interest for design and style, the built environment, architecture in general. He was very, let's say, oriented towards the arts from the very beginning. And unfortunately, because of the political situation in Europe at the times, in 1933, his family had to flee Germany because of the rise to power of Hitler and moved to London. We actually see here Sigmund and Lucian together in London. Sigmund moved from Austria to London in 1938. So here they are together. And their relationship was, in a sense, complex. We know that later on in life, Lucian would not be fond of any comparison or association between psychoanalysis and his work. He always rejected very vigorously any assumption that there is a psychological dimension to his work, although we know they also loved his grandfather. What's interesting about Lucian's upbringing, there are many things that are interesting about it, is related to his difficulties, the challenges he encountered when he moved from Berlin to Britain and struggled with English. He started with assimilating himself in the culture, which some of his biographers have actually read as a sign of his propensity to engage with animals, as we see here in this beautiful portrait. And later on in life, animals have played a very important role in Lucian's life. And he also, of course, he had his whippets like Pluto, and he also painted his companion animals, as we see here in these examples. The major turning point in his life when it comes to just painting in general and art certainly came with Cedric Morris. I hope many of you are familiar with Cedric Morris's career. He's certainly a well-known name in the United Kingdom, very much cherished artist who focused on flowers. And Lucian Freud ended up in the East Anglia School of Painting and Drawing in Essex, which was headed by Cedric Morris. And it was because initially he knew he wanted to study painting, but somebody told him, you really need to study with Cedric Morris to get to the core of what it means to be a contemporary artist. And that's how he relocates from Goldsmiths in London to East Anglia, and he ends up burning the school down just about a year after getting there. Apparently, as the legend goes, he was smoking a cigar through his studies as an artist, and left one unattended overnight, and he ended up destroying the school. There are different iterations of the story, but it seems that many corroborate the facts. So Cedric Morris is the artist and teacher who really introduced Lucian Freud to the beauty of flowers. And that led him to understand what painting meant and how painting could allow him to access plants and to relate to plants in a different way. So it's from the early 40s, late 30s that we encounter some of Lucian Freud's earliest works on plants. And as you can see here, the early works are very linear, very dry in essence, and inspired by the tradition of botanical illustration with the plain background as we see here. Of course, they're highly interpretative, and at times, as you can see, they also reconfigure and reimagine the tradition of the still life in art. I just wanted to quickly give you an explanation of why the book is called Lucian Freud Herbarium. Why did I decide to focus on this word specifically, since Lucian Freud didn't dry plants himself as an artist, he didn't collect plants. But there's something about the history of herbaria and what they mean that I found very meaningful, at least metaphorically, in the context of what Lucian Freud wanted to accomplish with his paintings of plants. Now, this is one of the oldest herbaria we have. And, you know, when the term herbarium is used in the English language, it has come to more specifically define the idea of a book, a compendium of dried specimens, as we can see here on the right-hand side, of dried and flattened plants. And the origin of the herbarium is really fascinating in itself. You can see here another very old herbarium from the 17th century. Of course, as you probably know, plants deteriorate over time despite the process of preservation involved in herbaria, and they lose color, the petals, the blooms fade, but they still remain very important markers for scientists, very important resources and reference points that are still important, and they're still used today in research. Luca Ghini, an Italian botanist, was credited with the invention of the herbarium, and unfortunately his Renaissance herbarium has not survived to us. However, the work of Gerardo Cibo, one of his followers, one of his students, survived. And this is where things become a little bit more ambiguous and complicated with the definition of what an herbarium was in the Renaissance and until roughly the 17th century. So today we distinguish between herbaria and herbals. And herbaria are the books containing dried specimen. Herbals signifies the representation of plants as we see here. So drawings of plants, paintings of plants in plates collated in a book. The word of Gerardo Cibo is incredible, as you can see, because it contextualizes the plant itself like you would see it in a herbarium, but in the context of illustration. Cibo doesn't use yet the plain background that will become important during the 17th and 18th century, the scientific approach to botanical illustration. But what he does is to try and connect the plant with the environment in which it grows. So he actually pioneers an ecological perspective on the life of plants. That said, things are complicated, as I was saying, because the terms herbaria and herbals are used interchangeably until the 17th, 18th century. So I played a little bit with this ambiguity in assigning the title to the book. You can see how beautiful these works by Cibo are, and you can also appreciate how different they are from the medieval herbals that were created to identify plants in order to cure those who needed to be cured, and also from bestiaria, the bestiarium, which was a religious book, which, as you can see, featured many plants that had nothing to do with realism and the actual morphology of plants. And as you will see today, realism plays a really important role in the work of Lucian Freud. That's why I'm also gearing towards the importance of realism at this point in the talk. As we know, botanical illustration and entomological research will lead to a clarifying approach, a scientific approach that capitalizes on the plain background and that isolates the botanical object in such a way that it can be appreciated fully and that it can be disentangled from its connections to the outside world, as we can see here in this beautiful work by Miss Sarah Ann Drake. The idea to extract the work from nature. So the herbarium today, as I said earlier, has become more defined and more precisely focused. The word itself has become more focused on the tradition of collecting plants and archiving plants. So this is the herbarium at the New York Botanic Garden. And you can see, of course, that it's filled with amazing dried and preserved specimens. So there is something interesting about the notion of representing plants, as we have seen in the work of Chibo, so beautiful drawings that capture the color of the leaves and petals in a very accurate way, and the scientific desire to preserve the actual body of the plant, even if it is not aesthetically preserved to the best of the possibilities. There's an idea of truth that runs right under this desire to preserve plants, whether through art or whether scientifically. And it's an idea of truth that we also find in art. For instance, what does truth mean in art? It means many things. And I'm just going to glide through some amazing works of art to give you an idea of how the conception of truth and representing anything from a truthful perspective changes over time and across cultures. At the times of the Greeks, of course, Venus de Milo is a great example of truth in beauty. The beauty of proportion is what defines the Greek conception of what is truthful about humanity. And that idea reverberates through the Renaissance, and we see it in the recovery of realism, in the beauty of the architecture and light. Truth, once again, is in proportion and harmony. We find it in the geometrical structures that underlie works of art such as this one by Piero della Francesca. But things change, philosophies change, and by the time the realist movement comes to the scene in the mid-19th century, truth is related to the representation of the poor, the representation of the social classes, the abandoning of the cliches of classical art itself. This desire to capture truth through art takes us through the work of artists such as Manet, who scandalized Paris like nobody else, replacing the tradition of the Venus with a prostitute, so truthful he wanted to be about the society he lived in. He incorporated a black maid, and Parisian society was shocked by the amount of truth that was represented in this work. Truth in art, to Mary Cassatt, one of the few impressionist female protagonists of the movement, was to represent women in gardens, because they couldn't be accessing the streets and the environment, the outside environment, like Monet did or like Pissarro did. They had to be accompanied by a male chaperone at all times. The truth in Cézanne is to look at different objects from different points of view and to bring them all together into one cohesive work. And of course, that leads us to the truth of Cubism, to include time in the representation. And in Futurism, to include movement into painting. How close to the truth of representation can we be when photography is invented and photography becomes to challenge painting, to capture truth in new and exciting ways, perhaps in ways that photography couldn't even accomplish itself. That's how artists like Wilfredo Lam look for truth in heritage, in tradition, in nature, or like in the surrealist work of Remedios Varo, it's the unconscious that provides an idea of what truth in painting might mean, or in spirituality, like Ilma af Klint, as we see here, in the abstraction of Norman Lewis and how abandoning reality can actually be truth, or even with Lucio Fontana and the idea that ultimately painting is not capable of accessing truth because it's always a representation of something else, that it's between us and the world itself. So, what is this idea of truth in the context of Lucian Freud? Many of you are familiar with Lucian Freud and his body of work, know that he was interested in the nude, that he's famous because he represented he captured the beauty of lots of naked bodies. But there's something else he did in his career that it's really fascinating. This is a quote from Caroline Blackwood, who says that Lucian Freud, when he painted a sink, it gives off a sinkness so powerful, it seems to exceed what even sinks can exude. Now, I don't know if you had the opportunity to look at a sink and experience the sinkness of the sink, but what she meant is that this is what a sink looks like when Lucian Freud paints it. There's something about the lack of glossiness, the desire to get to a raw representation of the object, that it's essential to his perspective, essential to the idea of what painting can allow him to accomplish. And this is what Lucian Freud himself said about his nudes. He said, part of my liking to work from the naked is for that reason. I like people to look as natural and as physically at ease as animals, as Pluto, my whippet. So this idea of the nude, of course, is extremely important in the history of art, but this is how the nude has been approached in art. You can see this birth of Venus with a beautiful, perfected and idealized, extremely white body by Alexander Cabanel, and other examples from the Renaissance by Giorgione. Everything is beautiful and idealized. We find here this beautiful Venus of Urbino by Titian. And this is Lucian Freud's idea of what a nude entails. You can see the level of truth and realism in the representation. The painting remains realistic, but at the same time, it shows a type of truth that has been hidden away by art. It shows a joy to be and inhabit your own body that classical art had removed from the lexicon, from the vocabulary of art. There is something really fascinating about this desire to be honest in painting when this honesty entails the portrayal of plants. We can argue that plants are always naked. Plants are always bare. What is there to see is across the leaves, through the branches, on the petals. There is something about plants that makes them what they are, that it's in a sense superficial, but not superficial in a negative way. It's superficial in the sense that plants are almost entirely surface. Everything we see is the structure and the essence of their bodies. What goes on inside and what goes on underneath in the roots is equally important. But so much of their bodies is actually exposed to us, and it's what relates to the world, to the impact of the world at all times. One of the things I find really fascinating about this idea of nakedness, this idea of representing plants in a bare way, is how Lucian Freud decides to choose plants, like in this beautiful example that you see here called Two Plants, and to choose them in a way that plants can be allowed to evade the tradition of symbolic representation that we have become accustomed to with art. Of this painting of Two Plants, which by the way took 3 years to make, Lucian Freud said that it almost drove him mad, that it was like composing a massive piece of classical music in which if he changed one tiny thing on one side, another thing would get out of kilter at the other. And he refers to what you're seeing now, which is very little leaves, very minute details, as portraits. He said, I felt like I had to um, create little portraits of leaves. So that gives you an idea of the connection between his interest in nakedness, this desire to get to the bottom, to the truth of who somebody might be, but also not to smother the world with metaphors and symbolic meaning that might cloud our vision of plants. What if a plant is just a plant? And what if we can paint a plant in a pot? This is such an insult, in a way, to the tradition of classical art and the embellishments of classical art when we actually see a terracotta pot with a broken shell in it and soil, embracing the idea that this plant is nothing fancy, but it's a plant that shares the environment with us. It's something that Lucian Freud returns to, this intimacy with his plants throughout his career. This is a painting he made towards the end of his career, and it's of his garden. I'm going to talk to you about his garden later on through this talk, which is also fascinating because he was not your average kind of gardener. He was not your green thumb wellies and shears sort of person, but nonetheless he loved his plants in different ways. So I wanted to bring you back to the idea of symbolism, and how is it that symbolism can actually get us to look at plants while asking us to look elsewhere. And I wanted to show you this beautiful example by Louise Moyon, an extremely talented French artist who created one of the most beautiful still lifes of the 17th century. As you can see here, the tradition of using fruits and flowers at times to convey religious meanings. All the fruits that you see here, including the bunch of asparagus, carry Christian theological implications. Like the cherries represent the Passion of Christ, the peaches are associated with the Madonna, and the asparagus with wealth and abundance. On the left-hand side, where you see those pods, the left hand, the one further close to the left is a pod of broad beans. And right next to it is a pod filled with peas. Art historians have scratched their heads to understand what symbolism might apply to these two pods, and have failed to find any reliable reading because they are not part of the repertoire that other artists used at this time. However, they end up assuming that the two broad beans represent the parents and the peas represent the children. So that's a representation of the family as inscribed in vegetation. The tradition of using plants to express symbolic meaning runs right through the 16th and 17th century, and it becomes even more important during Victorian times, during the 19th century. We look at beautiful compositions of flowers such as these, but what we're asked to do is to decode the embedded meaning, which has got nothing to do with plants themselves. This is the paradox of the history of plants in art. You can see here in this other beautiful example, poppies represent, these are peony poppies that represent death, roses represent love, and a white cabbage butterfly, as you can see, rests on the rose, which means love, while a moth rests on the poppy, underpinning the idea associated with them, death and sleep. So this contingency of using symbolism to express something through plants, I argue in my book, is part of a broader symptom of feeling that nature is not enough throughout the history of humanity, throughout Western conceptions of what nature can be. We need to bring our voices into the plants and also into the animals. We have to turn them into symbols in order to enrich what otherwise to us might seem terribly poor. And this is one of the biggest issues with our cultural upbringing. We don't even realize that that's what we do. But it's as if we were compensating for a shortcoming of natural subjects through art. We see it in so many amazing works of art, like Ophelia by Millet, in which once again the meaning of flowers is contributing to the understanding of the scene itself. Once again, we find the poppy here on the right-hand side, which is a symbol of sleep and by association, death. So I personally appreciate the beauty of symbolism and plants. I think it's amazing and extremely poetic. But yet, I also recognize the limitations of this approach. And that's when I think that Lucian Freud really changed the way in which plants could be represented. This is one of his early masterpieces involving plants. You can see it's been made in 1951, and it's technically a double portrait of a yucca and Harry Diamond, who was a friend of Freud, who lived in the East End of London, pretty rough and ready area at the time, and which Freud claims had been subjected to incredible violence and mistreating when he was a child, and therefore was most likely to grunt than speak full sentences. What is fascinating about this portrait, this double portrait, is how Lucian Freud switches the traditional balance in art between background and foreground. And where plants have been at the background of human affairs throughout the history of art, Lucian Freud places the plant at the front. That's how he ignites this chain reaction of unsettling considerations. Why is the plant at the front? How is the plant the same size of the human? And how does the plant command the same amount of attention? You can see the incredible detail that Lucian Freud applied here to the representation of the plant, and how certain details like the unsettling of the carpet lend themselves to a possible narrative. When we look at details such as this, you can see the carpet unsettled on the right-hand side again, we're left to wonder if the plant might have moved on its own accord while Harry Diamond was out. The painting suggests a sudden return to home to find the plant vibrating with this presence that commands his attention. It's almost like a confrontation. It's almost as if the two are looking at each other as equal. And there's something incredibly fascinating about the fact that this plant, yuccas, in a pot, carry no symbolism whatsoever. Over and over and over in his career, Lucian Freud avoids plants that have been subjected to symbolic meaning in the tradition of still life. And he does it intentionally because he knows that symbolism will smother whatever encounter we can have, let's say whatever truthful encounter we can have with a plant. The same, of course, applies to a human. So he's basically taking what he's learned about the nakedness of humans a step further into the nakedness of plant. Not wearing symbolic meaning equates to the nakedness that this plant can display. And as you can see here, the plant doesn't look particularly happy. It clearly hasn't been kept and cleaned and, let's say, handled in a way that a botanist would, or in a way that a true gardener in the traditional sense would. Lucian Freud had this desire to let his plant do its thing, to become what they had to become, without too much manicuring, without too much care, to just let them unfurl into their own truth, whatever that might be. By far, I have to say, studying the body of work of Lucian Freud and his plants, this is my favorite representation of plants by Freud. And once again, you can see how Freud switches the background and foreground. This is a striped pandanus. And again, a pandanus doesn't carry any symbolic meaning. It's a houseplant. It became extremely popular during the 60s and 70s in the United Kingdom. It's one of those plants that you really have to work hard to kill. And you can see that once again here, Freud has no space for frills and rhetoric. He shows us the pot of the plant right at the base, which brings the representation once again within the domain of the domestic. And this is really important. Very rarely in his career, Lucian Freud painted plants outside. Most of his plants are indoor plants, plants that have shared time and space with him. And I'm very interested in this concept because no other artist has represented this intimacy with plants. And I know I'm talking here to an audience who loves, an audience of plant lovers. You have your potted plants at home. You love them in one way or another. Even when you forget to water them, there's still love that will bring you back to them, to water them. And you know how to be successful at keeping your plants happy in a home environment. You need to attune yourself. You need to be able to read their language. It's a shared language that you develop with each individual plant. It's not something you can learn online or through books. How green should the leaves be? How vertical, horizontal, or diagonal should the stems be when the plant is happy? What is the plant's happiness? And how is the plant communicating this happiness to us? The shared language starts with you and the plant and dies with you and the plant, because even the same plant from the same, even a plant from the same species you acquire later might behave slightly different. And what's fascinating about this work is that Lucian Freud places himself, this is a self-portrait, in the background, rather tiny, listening. He's trying to listen. Art historians have never said anything truly meaningful about this painting because it puzzles them, because the arrogance of this plant in the foreground that takes up all the space makes it difficult to say anything that relates well or that complies with the ideas that we have inherited from classical art. Would it even be possible to listen to a plant? There's a fragment in a book where an art historian says he might be trying to hear somebody pass the plant. It's easier, it has been easier for us up until now to imagine another person outside the painting that Freud is trying to hear than to even entertain for a few seconds the idea that he might be actually trying to hear what the plant has to say. And I know it might sound a little bonkers, but there is beauty in that fear, in our relationship with plants, that we can let ourselves go and imagine that there is something that the plant is communicating. It's not through words, it's not through a vocabulary that's pre-established, but it's in the air between us and them. I like to think that it's something related even to humidity, that it's something related to vibrations, that it's something related to a feeling that we exude when we're happy or we're sad, like pheromones for insects, for instance, and how we know that plants are able to relate to pheromones. There might be something there we haven't discovered yet. And at the time Lucian Freud made this painting in 1968, the interest for communication and plants was absolutely rife. You can see here how beautiful, again, this work is, and how Lucian Freud dedicated much more attention to detail than he did to his own self-portrait right there on the left. So communication and plants became all the rage at the time this painting was made because of this work called The Secret Life of Plants. This was a book that was published in 1973, and it became a bestseller because it's where all the ideas that we can talk to plants and plants can hear, and also that plants appreciate classical music, come from. If you haven't read the book and would like to investigate the documentary that was produced in 1978, you're in for a treat. I would definitely recommend it for this weekend. It's available on YouTube, and actually that's the only way you can watch it because it never found release on DVD or any other form of official release because of a legal issue involved with the soundtrack, which, as you can see there from the poster, was composed and performed by none less than Stevie Wonder. It's incredible. It's an incredible film capturing many different attempts across science and native knowledge to communicate with plants and understand if plants are intelligent. So I like to think about the painting by Lucian Freud, Reflection Listening, in connection of that vibe that was around at the time, and the idea that plants might be able to communicate with us, or at least engage with us on a level of truthfulness that bypasses language and the symbolism that we have imposed on them. That's the time we can hear their voices. It's when we don't look for meanings that are wholly human. And I promised you I was going to talk about Lucian's garden. Now, Lucian Freud's garden in Notting Hill was a pretty small affair, and it was very, very messy. The same philosophy I have explored with you about letting plants do what they want, become themselves, the way they feel, apply to the garden. And as you can imagine, that's probably a gardener's nightmare. The idea of letting plants take hold of your garden and smother each other. When I researched, throughout the research for this book, I had the opportunity to speak to many Freud family members who spent time with me remembering and piecing together this relationship between Freud and plants that they had never really had the opportunity to explore before in quite such length. And I had the opportunity to see the garden and to talk to his assistant, David Dawson, who worked with Freud for 20 years. And he said, you know, one day this Badlia appeared in the garden. It was just a seedling. And Lucian wanted it to stay there and let it grow. It grew and grew and grew to a point that it smothered everything else around it, apart from the bamboo and this apple tree. And from the kitchen on the ground level, he said the garden really looked like a cave, because the Badlia created these arches, letting very little light filter through. But from the first floor, from the studio in which Lucian painted, it looked like a tropical forest. And of course, the garden has been trimmed since, because at some point you have to prevent plants from taking care of themselves too much, because it will just be impossible to step out into the garden. But what I find fascinating about these later paintings by Freud in his garden is this idea of, again, focusing on plants that have no symbolic meaning, plants that are actually considered weeds in the United Kingdom. Badlias grow everywhere, between cracks on rooftops as well as train tracks, and they're considered a pest. And I feel like sometimes Lucian Freud deliberately cultivates this idea of the weed, the plant pest, the plant that it's not worthwhile, and that it has something to do with his upbringing as a Jewish child who was transplanted from Germany to Britain against his will, and had to make do, had to kind of find his soil, his grounding in a very personal and very resilient way. Like the plants he paints tend to be very resilient. And again, like nothing about the representations of the garden tends to be sublime and staged. It's all very raw. It's all very genuine, very heartfelt, very present in the desire to communicate or to be with the plants in an unpretentious and unstructured way. So I just wanted to quickly wrap up and mention how, in a way, to me, Lucian Freud's paintings of plants stand somewhere between the botanical illustration, the detail, the realism of science, and the symbolic interpretation of painting, of the still life genre. They both influence the approach to painting that Lucian Freud developed over time, but at the same time, Lucian Freud's desire to get to a truth of plants for what they are really shines through somewhere in the middle. So it offers us an alternative to think about what our relationship with plants can be, and how it could be represented. He also shows us how art can help us engaging with plants differently. Just think about the enormous amount of time he spent focusing on his plants in order to portray them like he did, slowing down to the rhythm of plants and finding an attunement with the vegetal world in your home in a very personal and intimate way. So I just wanted to quickly wrap up with a few paintings we haven't seen and a few images from the New York Botanical Garden herbarium and collection. One of the plants I haven't talked to you about is the Zemelinda. Now, Zemelinda also goes by the name of Sparmannia africana, and we can see here, towering above one of Lucian Freud's many children. This is a plant that's important in the history of Lucian Freud because it was passed on to him by Sigmund. Sigmund grew Zemelindas in his studio in Austria, and he then brought the plant to London and proceeded to give cuttings to all his son and family members. So the Zemelinda that you see here is a straight connection to Sigmund Freud. It still exists. I saw it when I visited the home in Notting Hill. And it's a fascinating way in which we can all craft personal symbolisms with plants. While in the 17th and 18th century, looking at a rose implied love, looking at a poppy implied death. And those were religious symbols inscribed by the church into plants. We can all have personal symbols that we can use through plants to keep that plant alive as a meaning that's very intimate. And you can see this painting here, it does just that. Another important, here's the Sparmannia africana as it is represented in the New York Botanical Gardens archive, and here's a botanical illustration of the same plant. It's a beautiful plant related that belongs to the Malvaceae family, and it's originally from South Africa and Madagascar. So indoors it doesn't perform quite as well as it does outdoors, and it tends not to bloom. This is Aspidistra that we have seen in the beautiful work I showed you earlier called Two Plants. And Aspidistra is actually related to the asparagus. And it's from Eastern Asia and particularly from China and Vietnam. They became particularly well known in the United Kingdom as the cast iron plant, which is a nickname I love. That's because it was impossible to kill them. And I also had the opportunity to see this very plant in Lucian Freud's home. Again, testament to the fact that it's very hard to kill them. Badlia, as we saw earlier, is technically considered a weed at this point in the United Kingdom, although you can still buy it in gardening centers here in the United States. And again, it comes from Japan and China, and it was imported in Victorian times as an ornamental plant because of its beautiful flowers, but it adapts so readily to the temperate climates of Europe that it has really become a weed and an invasive species. And we saw, of course, Badlia taking over Lucian Freud's garden. And of course, this talk wouldn't be complete with his love for cyclamens. Cyclamens that count 23 species of perennial flowering plants and that are originally from the Mediterranean area. Lucian Freud loved cyclamens and generally speaking loved white flowers. When I talked to David Dawson and other family members, they all recalled very fondly how once a month Lucian Freud would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, if not earlier, to go to the flower market in Covent Garden in London, which no longer is in the Covent Garden Square in the heart of London, but it's in southwest London, to buy white flowers in bulk. And he would buy lots of cyclamens in the right time of the year, as well as white lilies and other flowers that would fill his home. And even to this day, David Dawson's buy white cyclamens every year to have in the house. The one thing he said about white cyclamens that's really fascinating is that not only they're beautiful and he loved the fragrance of them, but there's something extremely tragic about the way they die and how the flowers just tumble at some point, almost at once, and the plant just looks exhausted by this beautiful display. Not only Lucian Freud's cyclamens, one of his perhaps best portrayal and most unusual portrayal of plants, because I've been telling you up until now that he really focused on weeds and, you know, technically speaking, ugly plants. And this is probably the prettiest he ever painted. But you can see here too how he's not concerned with symbolic meaning and how he's concerned with this idea of messiness. This plant looks already like it's shaped up in a way that doesn't really comply with the expectation of the gardening center. And he painted it more than once. This is actually a mural work that has a complicated history. What's fascinating is that the mural work in which he painted a couple of leaves and a flower was technically an homage to his first marriage and Caroline Blackwood, his wife. And it was in his living room in Coombs Priory in Shaftesbury. And one of the fascinating things is that the owners of the property, once Lucian Freud and his wife sold it in 1958, somehow didn't like the work, so they painted it over. Of course, at that time, Lucian Freud wasn't as famous as he became, and the painting remained covered behind paint for 40 years. When the building was purchased by a new owner who knew about the existence of the painting because of, this is the home itself, because of this beautiful photograph taken by Cecil Beaton, which clearly shows that Lucian and the painting existed at the same time at Coombe Priory. They stripped the paint off and found it. Of course, at that time, the fresco, the painting itself was worth lots of money, probably in the region of £1 million or more. And when they sold the property, they decided to remove it, to take it with them. However, the newer owner of the property wanted it back because the property was listed as heritage and nothing from it could be removed. So the previous owner had to put it back in place. It's probably one of the most troubled mural painting ever in the history of British art. And another cyclamen mural work here at Chatsworth, it began because Lucian Freud was a friend of the Duke of Devonshire, and it was meant to cover the whole wall of the bathroom in cyclamen, but the work was not finished, apparently because of some inconvenient flirting that was happening at Chatsworth, which led Lucian Freud to leave, and perhaps with the intention of returning. A box of oil colors and brushes was found only a couple of years ago in a cupboard at Chatsworth that said, "Property of Mr. Lucian Freud, please do not remove." However, he never returned to complete the work. And you can see here again how beautifully detailed his representation of cyclamens is. And on that note, I hope you enjoyed our journey in the work of plants, the paintings of plants of Lucian Freud, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. That was remarkable. A fascinating overview of Lucian Freud's work and his deep personal connect with the vegetable world. We are all delighted and so glad that he's not only a painter, but also a botanist. It's now time for the Q&A, and my colleague Charles Zimmerman will moderate the questions. We'll go a little bit over time in order to, we have already a lot of questions. So back now to Charles to moderate those.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Giovanni, for your excellent presentation. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions, please go ahead and add them to the Q&A. You also have the option of thumbs upping the questions that others have written before you. And that way we can help prioritize the questions that are most pertinent to the most folks here. Giovanni, let's start with one that has received a couple upvotes already. What mediums did Lucian Freud work in his paintings and otherwise?
Could you say that again? I missed the beginning. There was a glitch. What
mediums did Lucian Freud?
Okay. The beginning of his career is actually focused on paper and just graphite, as well as ink and watercolor. And in the painting I showed you earlier with the confrontation of plants, the Paddington painting from the early 50s is his first full-blown masterpiece in oil color, which really shocked those who knew him from before. It's important to remember that Lucian Freud attracted a lot of attention as a young artist. His work was already collected by Tate very early on when he was in his 30s. And for him to reinvent himself entirely from a painter who predominantly worked with paper and graphite, ink, and watercolor into oil to the level that we've seen together today was astonishing.
Thank you. Another very popular question: beyond his own garden, were there gardens in London or elsewhere that Lucian worked, where he sketched or studied plants? What about his library? Did he collect illustrated botanical books or prints?
He was not a traditionalist when it came to gardening or when it came to the study of botany. But we know, for instance, that one of the works of art that really had an impact on him was The Great Turf by Dürer. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this work. It's basically an incredibly realistic patch of grass that was painted by Dürer, Albert Dürer, during the Renaissance. And apparently a print of this amazing work hung in his family home in Berlin before he relocated to London. And that reference has come up a few times among family members who recall how fond he was of Dürer and that work specifically, and also through the work of other biographers. What's interesting about that work specifically, it's that it's very much in line with what Freud will do with his own plants. Dürer painted with incredible nobility, no frills, no idealization, no desire to capture symbolic meaning, a chunk of grass, what we would call weeds today. And you can see that approach reverberating through Freud's work, also in the precarious balance between botanical illustration and painting, because you can see that that work by Dürer is effectively already heralding what scientific botanical illustration will do. It has a plain background, you know, it isolates the weeds. But he wasn't necessarily a lover of botanical illustration per se. He loved paintings of plants and trees. He was very much fascinated by a number of artists like Chardin. You know, he was certainly a connoisseur of the still life genre and what it had done to the natural world. Charles, I need you to unmute yourself.
My apologies. Next up, we have a question originally from Emily. There seem to be some parallels between Freud's treatment of plants, I'm sorry, this word is escaping me, and pre-Raphaelites of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. Super detailed, moving away from symbolism, like you said. Was he thinking about Ruskin or the pre-Raphaelites at all? Do you know?
He was certainly very knowledgeable about them. And, you know, you can't be an artist in Britain and not be familiar with the pre-Raphaelites, also because they're everywhere. Lucian Freud had the opportunity to visit the collections of Tate Britain and the National Gallery outside opening hours, as you know, especially when he became the famous painter that he became, and he was very knowledgeable about the pre-Raphaelites. I think the main difference between the pre-Raphaelites, let's say that the similarity there certain is with the accuracy and intention to represent detail. So for instance, I'm thinking about the Malay painting I showed you, Ophelia. You can see a parallel there. Malay went on site to capture those plants and to make them look as messy and wilted and damaged as they appear in the British countryside at that time of the year. So in a sense, I think inspiration came from the pre-Raphaelites. However, everything the pre-Raphaelites painted when it came to flowers and plants was reliant upon the meaning of flowers that has a symbolic root. So they were massive fans of the Victorian trend of assigning a language to flowers, which in a way was a kind of more popular culture iteration of the religious symbolism of the 17th century and 18th century. So during the Victorian period, books were published in which newer symbols were associated with yellow roses and other varieties that didn't necessarily play an important role in religious symbolism. And it kind of expanded the range of meanings we associate with flowers. And the pre-Raphaelites were very knowledgeable about that. What we see is that Lucian Freud, in a sense, uses that kind of realism to just disregard those meanings. These plants never have that desire to say anything that it's not related to what they are.
Mm. I have to insert a question of my own.
Very welcome.
So as a botanist and thinking about plant conservation, it's something that we think about often. The concept of plant blindness comes up a lot. Mm-hmm. The theory that we are as humans often by nature avoiding looking and thinking about plants as important, and instead look for animals and things that are more like us. And your description of historical treatments of plants and art seem to reflect that similar pattern of plant blindness, whereas Lucian seems to have seen the plants for what they are. Do you see these kinds of parallels in conservation and things relate to art in this way?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And plant blindness is a reality. And I think the paradox I tried to outline with the focus on the symbolic representation of still life painting is to even make us aware of the fact that even when art told us to look at plant, we were looking elsewhere. It was still a form of plant blindness, you know. The idea of plant blindness really entails overcoming plant blindness entails to see plants for what they are. And I think that that's also saying what I'm saying means to edge very close to a cliff, because what are plants? Lucian Freud gave us one version of what plants are to him. You know, these companions in pots he spends time with, but he doesn't love in a kind of gardening green thumb kind of way. They are certainly present, certainly real, certainly spanning long periods of time. One of the things I love about Lucian Freud's plants is that you can see it in how contorted they are, in the damages that they've been around a long time. And you know about that pride when you have a plant that stayed with you for many years. You know you cannot buy that in a shop. You cannot go to the Home Depot or a gardening shop and get a really weathered house plant that has shared history with you. And that makes them special, but that's only one of the ways in which we can overcome plant blindness. And I think one of the things Lucian Freud certainly does, because of the medium of painting, and I have not mentioned how slow he was. He never painted through photographs. I think that that's an important thing to remember, because today it's so easy to take a snap of something and just return to that photograph. To him, painting was always a matter of spending quality time with the sitter or with the subject he painted. And I think that is a massive lesson for us in this, like, even more now online times we live in. The speed, you know, I think coronavirus has led us to believe we were slowing down at the beginning, but I think it did exactly the opposite. We're all working even faster now, giving multiple talks a day because we can, it's all in the hands of Zoom. And slowing down to actually attune ourselves to the rhythm of plants is also another form of overcoming plant blindness. It's a way to see them on a temporal scale that we can learn from. And of course, other colleagues of mine, I do too, but other artists as well, focus on the notion that overcoming plant blindness means to see the role plants play in biosystems, in ecosystem, and to understand how they're not simply beautiful creatures in their own right.
Thank you for that perspective. We have lots of questions and comments about the works that you showed, specific questions and comments about their form. I think our audience is very much interested in engaging in this critical analysis that you do with plants. And we have a lot of like-minded people in this virtual space. Unfortunately, we don't have enough space to get to all the detailed questions today, but I did want to just ask one which relates to your book. So all these paintings, many of them that you displayed, are they available in your book?
Yes, actually, my book, of which incidentally, I have a copy right here. See how it works? It's actually filled with beautiful illustration. The publishers, Prestel, did a fantastic job with securing, see they're large and beautiful, in securing as many illustrations of plants of the work of Lucian Freud, because nothing of this kind had ever been done before. This is part of the paradox. An artist so famous and so valued in the history of modern art and contemporary art had been overlooked. Let's say a fifth of the body of his body of work has been overlooked over time because simply we have considered plants less worthy of attention. So what I wanted to accomplish was to have almost all the paintings of plants in the book, and that's what you will find in the book. It's the most exhaustive compendium of his paintings of plants, and all in color as well. So we really went all the way into wanting to make a very comprehensive account of what he accomplished.
Well, this has been all very fascinating. I wish we had more time to go into more details, more questions. I just want to remind you that the conversation has been recorded and will be sent to you by Zoom sometime at the end of next week, so you can listen again. And I also would like to say that the book is available at the New York Botanical Gardens bookstore. You can go and walk there and also get the book and enjoy it during the winter months. Thank you all for joining today. We hope to see you back again in a few weeks, namely on January 8th in the new year, when we discuss the captivating history of dried plants collection a little bit more with Dr. Barbara Thiers in conjunction with her important new book, Herbarium, The Quest to Preserve and Classify the World's Plants. And I'm sure Dr. Alloway will be joining us in the virtual space then. Until then, everyone, stay green, stay well, and take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you again. It's been a great
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Giovanni.
Bye. Thank you, Giovanni.
Thank you, everybody.